All right. I thought of singing, but you don't want that. So we'll just have to go ahead and get started. I am so pleased to have Stefanie Rucker with me today to have a conversation about regulating at the speed of innovation. I'm not going to attempt to say out CDPHE, because that's all I got, like everybody else. You know, Stefanie was CDPHE. So I'll maybe let you kind of introduce yourself and your agency again. I know you did yesterday, but in case we've had any change of folks in the room. But I wanted to talk a lot about your new intensity rule, and in part just because I've been super inspired by it. Now, maybe more comments on that in a moment. So if you want to introduce yourself, then we'll jump in.
Sure. So again, my name is Stefanie Rucker. I'm with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment in the Air Pollution Control Division. And yes, I have had to practice that and say that over and over and over again multiple times to get it so smooth. We are a newly created Office of Innovations in Planning and Air Quality Data, and we are a currently growing group. It was a situation where for the last probably 8 years, I've been asking my director to create a job for me where my job was all of the side jobs that I did instead of having a job and a bunch of side jobs, and they finally did it. So now we've got the Office of Innovations, and we're getting some opportunity to do some really cool things.
That is really exciting, and I have never figured out how to make the side jobs the real jobs, so we'll come back to that later. So what I've been so inspired about by the methane intensity rule is that we live in this dichotomy where everyone complains that emission factors aren't good enough, yet it's what we have today. And at the same time, we all say we have to do better because the need to drive methane reductions down is now, and we need to be able to do that credibly and verifiably. And so I've been so inspired by how you guys have approached this, because it kind of set us up in a way that was, let's work with what we have today in a way that builds into tomorrow, but gives us the speed that we need to get busy. And so maybe it's useful for the audience to just tell us a little bit about the methane intensity rule, how it's set up, what are the goals, how does it work?
Yeah, so methane intensity was a product of our first authority that we got from our legislature to regulate greenhouse gases directly. And one of the many things that we did in December of 2021 was establish this intensity rule. And the intensity rule is essentially what you think of as intensity. All of you probably know at least a number or an intensity calculation. But in Colorado, that calculation is total emissions company-wide of all greenhouse gases on a calendar year divided by total production for that same time period for that calendar year. So, and that production includes both oil and natural gas. So we've got a conversion to BOE that we are using, and so it's divided by that total BOE, and that's how we kind of established it. And originally we wanted to incorporate this measurement idea into that right away, and it just wasn't quite ready. And some would argue it's not quite ready today, but we're doing it anyway. So we wanted to do that, but we knew we couldn't do that in 2021. So instead we used our targets to create the intensity standards. They start in 2025, they drop in 2027, it drops again in 2030. It includes all pre-production and production emissions, which was, for those of you that are lawyers in the room, you might know that there are federal preemptions on certain ways that we can regulate things like non-road engines that are used during the pre-production process. This was a way around those federal exemptions where we couldn't say directly regulate those engines, but we can incorporate them into this overall intensity standard. So there were some opportunities there to grab and pull in things that we wouldn't typically be able to regulate. And then another piece that we really built into it, because we've been doing regulation for a long time, we've been doing enforcement for a long time, and one of the banes of the industry, of the oil and gas industry, is asset transfers. Anyone knows They are trading assets all of the time. And the EHS folks usually don't know that's about to happen until after it's happened and it's actually in the news. And then they're calling us and saying, I guess we've got another 1,000 wells. And so we really wanted to say, you can't meet this intensity target just by selling off crappy assets. We wanted to cut that off. And so we said, instead, if you acquire assets, you have to bring it up to a minimum standard, that individual facility. So even though this is a company-wide program, an intensity standard, if they acquire assets, they have to bring those assets up, and they have a timeline to bring those assets up to a certain standard. So there is no more of this idea of, I'll just sell all of my crappy stuff and someone else can deal with it. No, they're going to have to do that. They're going to have to do something with all of those facilities.
I hope you'll forgive me for kind of going off of my pre-scripted questions, but you said a couple of things there that I think are really, really important. And the first is defining a denominator in this intensity standard that is not just gas, right? Because I think, and I have this conversation with OGMP companies all the time when they say, what should the form of my standard be? And and producers like intensity standards as a general matter. This is what we find in the OGMP, across the board, they choose intensity standards because, when you operate an asset that your goal is to decline, then the only way to continue to create value from your company is to produce more or grow in some other way. And so the key there is that methane emissions are a product both of the oil and of the gas, right? And so if you assign all of the methane emissions to just the gas, then you kind of have this imbalance that creates this bias for dry gas production over oil production. And I think that's such an important point. So could you talk a little bit more about, as you guys were deciding metrics, and I think the second part of that is the numerator in your standard now incorporates measurement or incentives to incorporate measurement. So could you just talk a little bit about kind of as you were selecting those metrics, and that is something people just labor over, right? Yeah. What were the things you thought about, and how did you come to these particular metrics to get to your intensity?
Yeah, because we've been doing this for a long time and working with industry for a long time, we knew the tricks and we knew the ways that they were going to work themselves out of something. And there's a lot of oil production in Colorado, and we didn't want to incentivize oil production over the gas production because we were already seeing, flaring of natural gas, of associated gas, and we were trying to stop that anyway. And had we created a standard that only really accounted for gas production and they were just burning it as waste gas, they weren't necessarily even accounting for that in their ECMC reporting on an annual basis, and therefore they wouldn't even have to account for it in their production to us. So it kind of created this opportunity for us to say, no, you have to account for both. We want to account for everything. And the main thing there is that you have to come up with what is your factor for converting to BOE, or barrels of oil equivalent, for your natural gas production. And as long as you have defined that, then everyone's on the same playing field, and it's a well-known number. What they report for production on an annual basis is one of those things that they've been doing for a very, very long time. And so it's a number that we all felt comfortable with and confident in the accuracy of that number and the fact that it's been well established and everyone understands what it is. So that we could go do on the other side, the numerator, which is not so well defined or understood exactly what that number should be. And so on the numerator side, we knew that there were emissions that were not being captured, that were either unreported or they were underreported. And that's kind of the whole scope of this, was to say, we need to make sure that we are accounting for those. And one of the cool things about this intensity standard was that we have a lot of requirements that say, go and control your tanks by 95%, go and eliminate this number of pneumatic devices, go and do this. And because we have all of those really specific things, we really wanted to create more of this umbrella type of program that, again, could pull in things that we wouldn't traditionally be able to actually cover and try to get to we don't care where the emissions are coming from. You just have to account for them in this calculation. And so that was the concept behind it. And so to that, the only way we're going to start to know better what the emissions actually are is if we're incorporating measurement. And as all of you may know, some people think that that means going out and sticking a sensor at a site and bam, we know exactly what's coming out of that site at all times across the entire year, and it's easy. And the reality is, it's not easy. And so what we are really trying to do is create a system that allows for the growth in this area while really, really incentivizing the fact that we have to be measuring right now. We have to be actively measuring. We can't wait for the right answer. And some of you might have been familiar with our AIM process, which is our Alternative Instrument Monitoring Method process, which we developed back in 2014. And it's a very front-heavy requirement where the vendors who have this equipment have to submit these really detailed documents to us, and we go through this whole process to approve those technologies for use in LDAR. And I said, we cannot do that in this particular situation. We have to say, do your monitoring and tell us how you're going to use it. Instead of it being a monitoring pre-approval, it became a plan pre-approval. And so now they have to create their plans. They have to say, this is what I'm going to do. Here are the assumptions that go into that, right? None of these are predefined. I can't measure all elements of everything, but here are my assumptions that are going into that. And you're going to tell me what it is you're going to do. We're going to give you the thumbs up. Say, go do it in 2025. But in 2026, you have to report to me an evaluation of that program for that year. You have to tell me what went right, what went wrong, where you need to improve, what we need to learn from that opportunity, where you can minimize your assumptions, where you can get better information to make those assumptions. That's the whole point of this program, is that it needs to evolve over time. But again, we need measurement now. And so that's the whole structure that we put together.
I love that. And I also am suddenly having PTSD with the number of OGMP measurement plans I have graded in the last 3 years. I wonder who's going to grade these plans, who's going to review them and approve them.
There are a bunch of grad students in the audience that need jobs. That's what I heard.
And Colorado is better?
And Colorado is better.
But I've heard today that maybe North Dakota's the best.
Ooh.
I heard they have ranches.
Them's fighting words.
All right, well, So, being at the cutting edge of technology and innovation, it seems like one observation I've had with companies from the United States as they've joined the oil and gas methane program that's really distinct about United States companies is this acute attention to compliance assurance, right? They want to know, what is my checklist to make sure that I have a system in place to assure compliance with my air rules, and that even extends to the way they think about voluntary initiatives. So the idea of something flexible and that can change year over year is really comfortable to people outside of the United States in my experience. They say oh, okay, so then I just take as a homework the improvement. I say, yeah, that's it. And they say, okay, great. But in the United States, they say but how am I going to know in advance in my planning basis? And so you surely have had these conversations too, and I'm curious how you've navigated them since you'll be responsible for that compliance assurance.
Yeah, definitely. Compliance is always on our minds. And part of the reason for having this kind of plan pre-approval is that we are talking about it right now. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. This company is going to put on continuous monitors that I'll throw out Cube there in the room, Cube monitors. This company is going to potentially use Project Canary. That company is going to use Bridger. They all have kind of their different ideas about how to come to this. Some of them might even use more than one. Maybe they're using Longpath and Bridger. And so they're going to say, this is how many times I'm going to go out. Right now, there isn't a tool that is like, yes, this is the tool to determine how many sites I have to see. And so they're going to come up with that based on what we all understand right now. And they're going to say, this is how many sites I'm going to see. This is how I'm going to implement this. And this is how I'm going to use the data that I collect in my inventory. And as long as that kind of passes muster, which is a little bit amorphous right now, but it's going to come to a point where we say, yes, you're going to do that. And we're going to write it up in this protocol, and you're going to have permission to go and do that. And as long as you do it, you get the credit for it. So then it becomes, yes, it may not be a perfect way of determining their measurement-informed inventory. We may identify deficiencies, but we at least have said, there's your compliance certainty that you can go do this as long as you're faithfully doing what you're supposed to do. And the alternative for any of the companies that don't want to develop that kind of program, the state is doing our own measurements. And I think this is a really critical element, is everybody questions information that comes from operators. And so we incorporated this piece where we say the state is also going to do measurements. And we're going to do measurements on a basin level. It's not going to be over individual operators, but it's going to get us information potentially on small operators too, because those small operators are not likely to join in and do their own measurement. And so this is going to give us the opportunity to see a wider variety of sites. And we're going to develop what we consider a basin-wide default, which is essentially a multiplier. Say, okay, we estimate that emissions are undercounted by about 50%. So you have to multiply your reported inventory by 1.5. Or you can go down this path of creating your own plan. And so we're going to give them that opportunity, and we are going to cover all of those sources that are not going to be able to do that kind of measurement.
I love that because it gives you, I mean, if we look at the collection of operators that are out there doing voluntary measurements or have joined voluntary standards, they're still a minority in terms of the total number of operators in the United States. And so you need something that allows for attributing these methane emissions to operators and to operations even before everybody is fully subscribed to making these types of measurements, and for various reasons, right? And so in my mind, this is like the first example in the entire world, and I think that's why I get almost like goosebumps when I think about it, and in the conversations we've had over the last year, it's like the first time in the world anyone has come out and said, okay, here's how we're going to account for this methane, attribute it to the operators in a particular region, build in the flexibility that rewards going out and looking, but allows us to move forward with a credible set of information that represents the emissions from a particular region, right? Like this is the exact problem we face in the United States, is that like we put out an inventory, but then we make measurements and then we say they don't match, but then we continue to use the inventory that we say doesn't match. And so in your case, you're saying, okay, I'm gonna create a path for these two to converge. But in the meantime, I'm going to add credibility because we're still going to base on the total. And so I wonder, you know, because you are the first, right? Like you have birthed this concept into the world. What inspired you or motivated you in this direction?
I think a big piece of it, and I talked a little bit about this yesterday, but I think we sometimes get so focused in on these details, you know, how are we going to control this? How are we going to manage that? And we sometimes forget to kind of step back and think about the problem as a whole system, as a kind of holistically. And what we tried to do was to take that step back and say, okay, we have done all of these things. What are we missing? Like, how can we wrap those in? How can we grab them? How can we move this forward while also doing this? And we were in the position of having done that kind of exercise with industry in 2017 and 2018. Because in 2014, when we passed the new LDAR requirements and we had no venting from storage tanks, eventually operators came to us and they said, we don't know how to comply with that standard. And so we sat in a room with operators for a year and a half to come up with the storage tank and vapor control system guidelines, which are essentially that design, operate, and maintain. So now we're kind of taking that same process and concepts and applying it in a new area, because vapor control systems were evolving when we were writing that, right? Going through a stage of separation, 2 stages of separation, 3 stages of separation, where you're actually getting stabilized oil out of the end of a centralized processing facility. All of those things were developing at the time we were writing the storage tank guidelines. And here we are in a new situation where we're doing the same thing. And so I think it helped that we had gone through enough with a lot of these operators to have developed relationships that were less adversarial than they had been 10 years ago, where everything was a fight, and now it's a little more collaborative. It's a little more, okay, this is the problem. How are we going to solve it? And I think we did that also by pulling in EDF. We've been working with EDF for a long time. We've been working with Earth Justice, with Clean Air Task Force. I'm going to throw you guys out there because you're in the audience, and so, but there are others, right, that we've been working with for a really long time, and we just got really honest with each other. We got really honest. I made them come in and sit in a room on campus, post-COVID here, with me for 3 hours every 2 weeks, and I baked them things, gluten-free things, and they are delicious gluten-free things. And I baked them food, and every single time we would sit down, and there were a couple of times where I walked away and I was like, I don't know how we're ever going to do this. And then we would have this breakthrough, and we all kind of came together. And I think that it's ultimately the relationships that actually get you really cool and awesome answers and really let you innovate. And because as much as the science and all of this technical stuff like totally gets me excited, you have to have the relationship and the trust to move it.
I really appreciate that you baked things. When I was doing my first methane studies in the field, when I was still with an operator, that was also my move. I always showed up with baked goods, but they really liked gluten, and occasionally I made like meat too, because I was in Texas. I was in Texas, and so that's the land of gluten. Continuing on this like stakeholder process, which I think is so critical, I wonder, as you engaged with all these different parties, what were one or two of the things that you learned in these sessions that were surprising and then materially changed how you were proceeding?
I think from a scientific standpoint, and when I've spent a lot of time working on inventories, I've spent a lot of time in permitting where, emission calculation methodologies were like our bread and butter. And so I think one thing that I didn't fully comprehend or didn't fully understand going into this was just how dedicated certain of the stakeholders were to direct measurement, meaning methane measurement. And whereas I saw there are lots of ways that we can make improvements to this inventory. Obviously, we want accuracy. We would love perfect, but improvement is where we were aiming. And so I think there was a lot of discussion and a little dissent around should it be only direct measurement? And it really took a lot of kind of talking through the different perspectives to finally get to the point where we're like, oh, okay, I kind of see where you're coming from, because there was some tension there. And, the ultimate was, yes, direct measurement is absolutely critical, because that's what's telling us, hey, we've got a problem. But there are so many ways that we can make improvements to our inventories, and direct measurement isn't accessible to everyone. And so we have to find that balance of here's how you move forward, here's how you make progress, even when certain things are still not accessible. And that's what I think one of the things that maybe I didn't fully realize or comprehend going into it. That's probably the biggest one. I also was pretty fascinated at the eventual willingness to have something that was kind of malleable, something that was going to rely on this guidance as a piece as opposed to everything being in the rule. And we in Colorado, we've done that before, but this time there was a lot more attention on it. There's a lot more, fingers that are trying to get in and public interest in what it was we were doing. And so that's been pretty fascinating as well.
I have one more, and then I'll give you an opportunity to share anything else you additionally want and peek at the audience questions. What are the implementation challenges that you're anticipating? I mean, it seems like there's going to be just reams of new data, and not all the data are going to be the same. And, these are also, maybe we should catch up one day on these, like, here are 17 things I learned in OGMP on this point. But like both from new state measurement programs and operator challenges, like on both sides, what are the things you're anticipating being, implementation challenges?
Oh my goodness, so many. Like you said, there's going to be data that everyone goes, I don't know what to do with this. And I think from a state perspective, we have to be somewhat comfortable to say, okay, that's interesting, set it aside, move forward on what you do know, and then we're gonna come back to that. And that's the balance I think that we're gonna have to kind of play there. And that's gonna be uncomfortable, right? This is an uncomfortable space as a regulator. It's uncomfortable from the certainty perspective. It's uncomfortable from a public perspective because there is uncertainty there in terms of we can't just give you a number that we can say 99% sure that's right. And so instead, we are all going to be in this place of discomfort. And as long as we're all acknowledging that we're in this place of discomfort and we're working forward towards a goal, a common goal, then I think that we'll be okay. However, I need a lot more people. The data analysis is a special task. It is not something that just anybody can pick up and, sure, I'll do a bunch of data analysis. It's not what we're looking for. We need people who are actually skilled at data analysis, who are skilled at software, who are skilled at some of these kind of niche, types of experience and qualifications, but that are also willing to have the faith kind of in the bigger picture, because policy is always that, right? Policy is always a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit certain, and we all have to try to come together. It's not like the technical people and the engineers and the scientists always like the answer that the policy people come up with. And so we need at least enough of that flexibility in people to say, okay, I'm going to trust the process while also advocating for the details. And that's a really challenging place to be. And we need more people that are willing to kind of dive into that middle place.
You've also now made me feel like I should confess that I was born in Colorado, and so I can't be so strongly in defense of Texas in this situation.
What? Yeah, I knew you were a Colorado.
What else would you tell people? Like when you think about what you're most proud of about this rule or most excited about this rule, and I think I will carry with me for a long time to be with the process, but also working out the details in the meantime. Maybe just share with us just your views on it.
Oh my goodness. Every time I start talking about the technical aspects, I get really excited. I'm like, that's so cool. And then, I get to a point where I'm like, that's a question we're not going to answer today. And I say, please keep working on it. And then I go over here, but then I don't forget about you. I'm like, okay, we're going to come back to that. The piece that I think was the most personally satisfying, and this is because this is who I am, is that we got all of the right people to the table, that the technical people that need to be involved are excited and came and have come to Colorado at least twice, if not more times, and they've sat in a room with us in our discomfort, and we've argued about uncertainty, and we've argued about how to do measurement and what's enough, and whether or not you have to have operator involvement, and whether or not you have to know what's a maintenance event. Dan, I'm talking to you. We've argued all of that, and yet we've still found a path forward, and we've still come to largely consensus on that, right? And that is just a huge accomplishment, and I'm so very proud of all of us for our willingness to go ahead and be in discomfort together and to do it in a way that is going to, I think, change the landscape and really tell us things that we wouldn't have known had we not been willing to step out and do this. So I'm incredibly excited about the whole thing, but I'm also a big picture person, and the fact that all of these people came together and the relationships were built, that is like what warms my heart.
Thank you for that. And one of the reasons I find you just personally inspiring. I'm going to take a couple of these audience questions, which will probably prompt some other questions.
Okay.
So one of these is, and maybe I'll kind of just paraphrase a couple of these together. As a state regulator, with EPA concurrently revising Subpart W and the like, how are you thinking about how that rulemaking is going to change the landscape of federal reporting and how it will or won't be consistent with what operators are producing specific to their assets within Colorado?
I think we are always looking for opportunities to streamline, and so we'll be looking at Subpart W. We're particularly happy about the new methane slip factor. There are other elements that we're particularly happy to see because they're things that we have learned over time, and so we were excited to see EPA kind of moving along there. Our reporting is so much more detailed, though, in that our quote-unquote minimum threshold is anything that only emits 1 SCF. And
Oh my.
it's like basically non-existent, right?
Oh my.
And so it's an incredibly small amount that would not have to be calculated. And so we really are saying, no, give us everything. Make an estimate of everything. And not all of those estimates are going to be able to be measured. And so that's another kind of understanding. And so when we're talking about trying to coordinate with what EPA has done, we will be looking at it and we'll be building into our guidance, okay, here's where the methodologies that are prescribed in Subpart W are acceptable for us. And here are some areas where maybe it's not. And we're gonna say you have to do something slightly different. Operators in Colorado are pretty used to that at this point, so I don't know if we're going to get a lot of pushback. They would always love for us to just all do the same thing and take the same thing, but hasn't been our practice historically. So we'll continue to ask for more information than they would like to gather. Right now, we're getting more away from emissions and just talking about, well, what kind of operational parameters should we be collecting in our reports so that it can better inform the maze model, which is being developed by CSU, because until they know pressures and temperatures and all of that, those details, it's hard for them to incorporate that into the model that they're building. And so there are some things there that we're kind of negotiating with industry right now to say how much of that can we get and how can we build that in.
I love that. And I think, so many important threads to pull on there.
Yes.
I wonder, I hear people talk about when it comes to methane, Colorado is the California of the United States. And so how are you working with or collaborating with other states? And have you seen other states become interested or curious about what you're doing and consider kind of copying that model, or even maybe EPA themselves?
Absolutely. One of the fun things is that EPA has, NSPS Quad O was very much like our 2014 rule that we had developed with the LDAR and the storage tank components, with slight little differences, like we defined this slightly different, therefore the applicability is slightly different, and that always makes life fun for Colorado operators. But we have seen that for a number of years already, where there's been some kind of following along and seeing what we're doing and then implementing at least pieces of what we have done into NSPS Quad O. And you see that in the most recent iteration as well. And so, yes, EPA has been interested in what we're doing. For this intensity program in particular, we've had conversations with EPA, we've had conversations with DOE, we've had conversations with the UN Environment Program, we've had conversations with the delegation from the EU, we've had conversations with people in Canada and Alberta. A couple of weeks ago, just having conversations with California. It's been a lot of different people that are kind of interested in what we're doing. And when you talk about a surprise, in Colorado, we were kind of very focused. When we developed the December 2021 rule, we were very focused on Colorado and Colorado efforts and the requirements that were there. And then it wasn't until last fall that I went to a meeting in DC, and I was like so giddy that I had been invited, and I was like, I'm going to NASA, and then I realized I have to pay for my own coffee at NASA conferences, and I was so excited because I'm an engineer, I'm like, oh my God, NASA, and I went out to this, and all of a sudden I realized that people were interested in what we were doing, and a lot of people approached me, and I thought I was like this little peon that was just kind of Colorado. So it's been it's been incredible, the amount of people that have reached out to us and that have asked us questions, and we're really excited about it, and I love to talk about it because I get excited about it. So then I like solving problems, so it's fun.
I'm going to make an attempt to do math in my head here. Okay. So just, for our Canadian friends and those on the phone and the scientists that are not engineers, this chemist has attempted some mental math. And one scuff is like less than 20 grams, right? So it's a really small threshold.
It's really tiny.
Really tiny. Grams of methane, that's what you're tracking. Just incredible. Maybe I'll jump back, and there are a couple of different questions here. One to say, are you going to include carbon dioxide? Yep. Okay. That's a yes/no answer. Perfect.
Yes.
And then going back to, can you say more about the importance of trust and transparency as you've gone into this new foray of emissions policy?
Yeah. I don't think any of you would be surprised to hear that the public doesn't really trust the oil and gas industry. And as an extension, they don't necessarily trust the regulatory agencies over the oil and gas industry. And so it's been, I think, a failure on the part of a lot of us in the regulatory space that we packed our offices with engineers and scientists and lawyers. And none of them are well known for their ability to talk to the public. And so we kind of undermarketed ourselves for a really long time because we all just kind of put our heads down and we did our job, and we were, having strong belief in the work that we were doing. Everyone who works for government, we believe in what we're doing because otherwise we could make a lot more money somewhere else. So there's a lot of, we believe that we are doing the right thing, the best thing, and within the authority that we have. And that's the tricky part, right? We're not allowed to just do whatever we want. We have to meet certain parameters. We have certain authorities. We have to think about what it's going to cost. We have to think about, all of these elements. And so that's kind of where we had been for a really long time. And I think we were doing really great things, but the public isn't really aware of that because the public, they see what's happening in their communities. And what's happening in their communities is that there are more wells being drilled and that there's more activity. And so when you look at it from a regional perspective or a global perspective, you're thinking, no, that's great because these new horizontal wells, they're putting in all of this extra separation, they're doing all of this design work, they're doing all of these wonderful things, and they're getting rid of these older marginal wells that are much less producing, but also much, higher likelihood of having failure, of having emissions. So you're thinking this is a great thing, but when they're going in right next to a community, it's not a great thing. And our DJ Basin is right next to Denver, and there's a lot of development happening in that area, and arguably some development that maybe shouldn't actually be happening because it's literally happening in the gas patch. And so we have these communities where they're seeing this right next door, and they're next to the schools, and they're next to this stuff, and they're justifiably really concerned. And so when we have to think about it from the air quality perspective, from the Air Pollution Control Division's perspective, we have to be thinking about it on a local basis, on a regional basis, and on a global basis. We can't be just looking at it through any one lens. And so that's where transparency starts to come in. One, we need to be more transparent with what we're doing and how it all fits together, because there's not one mechanism to fix all of those problems. There are multiple mechanisms that affect local emissions here, and this one affects global emissions. But both of those initiatives, we want them to try to do as best they can to affect local, regional, and global, but they can't always do all. And so we have to do a better job of explaining this is how it all fits together, and also to hear the real feedback, to say, okay, where are we failing people? Is it in education? I think part of it's in education, but is it in actual policy limitations or lack of authority? Because there have been those real barriers as well. And so learning and listening takes a lot of grace, and it takes a lot of patience, because people are angry, and they're justifiably angry. But it's really hard to hear from a perspective of, I think I've dedicated my life to doing the right thing for the world and the globe and everyone out there, and then to be told in very point blank way that you're doing a terrible job is a really emotionally hard thing to do. And so what we have tried is to figure out how can we do that. And I think we have to do a better job of getting data out there. Data is incredibly hard to get out into the public sphere. It's incredibly hard. It's really hard to even describe to people why that's so hard, but it just is. We have to do a better job of educating the public, of working with the public, of talking to people. And I also want to really point to, we also have a lot of advocacy groups, and their whole job is to kind of represent some of these. And I would challenge those advocacy groups to get out and be doing some of that education too, because we need to partner with them as well. We've got limited resources, and we're putting a lot of those resources towards building up our capacity, but we also can't do everything. And so getting out into the communities, showing up at meetings is something that we want to be doing, and we're trying to do a lot more of. And also, we're going to be relying on other people helping to educate and advocate and make sure that we are getting all of the information we need.
One of the challenges with the OGMP is that to make it safe for operators to voluntarily participate and be trying new things, we have agreed with all these operators not to give their data to anybody. And so data comes in, one single number comes out per company to cover the entire company. That presents a challenge with the utility of the output of the program, even though I don't know a single operator who's ever gone down that measurement journey and not learned a lot. So I think the benefits accrue, but the output data is sparse. So can you tell us a little bit about, short of some sort of open records inquisition, what is going to be publicly available based upon all this collected data?
Yeah, so obviously we're trying to figure out how to make more of our data. So the inventories, they're publicly available. They're not publicly available in a very useful form at this point in time. They're spreadsheets that you can download from a Google Drive. That's the sophistication of Colorado. I'm going to throw that out there. But that's the reality of a lot of state agencies. Is our limitations are data management, storage, and then making it available. We're pretty good about making it available to ourselves internally. We figure out lots of ways, but to make it available publicly is a lot harder. And so I would say that the data we would like to make public is all of the inventory data, all of the information on what it is we did to create this default factor. So whether that's how we're doing the calculation and the assumptions that went into that and the data that we've collected to use that. But we acknowledge that we're not necessarily going to be able to publish all of a company's data or all of a vendor's data who's going out and doing these measurements. And so one of my kind of in the back of my mind, like what we need, and I'm kind of forcing IMDL into this position right now, and they may or may not want to actually be in this position, but we need kind of this data clearinghouse, this trusted body that is not necessarily governmental, that has maybe less restrictions on procurement and being able to go out and hire quality vendors to go and do the measurements, but that we can all, as a regulatory body, can trust the information coming out of them. And then they're going to have to provide enough information, and that's the balance that's really hard to define, but enough information that we can all say, yes, I can trust this, without necessarily giving away all data all the time. Because all data all the time is overwhelming and it becomes not useful. And so how do we balance that? And that's what we're trying to kind of figure out right now. We're working with IMDL right now to say, okay, let's figure out how we do this in this study. And assuming we work through all of the issues, because we will, and assuming that we kind of figure out what this all, how much is enough, and maybe we don't get it right this first time, and that's okay, then we will turn around and be able to say, okay, this is how we're going to do it going forward, and then we'll establish, okay, this is what we can provide, this is what we can't provide. And there are always going to be people unhappy with that, right? Yeah. There are people that are saying, no, all data all the time, it should always be available, and we will say, we can't. This is what we can do. This is how far we can go. And we'll keep figuring out new ways to make more data available, but there has to be a negotiation there, and we're working on that.
Well, sounds like you have your work cut out for you to solve that. Next, you'll need all those relationships you built up to make the rule.
How many things can I negotiate? That's how I roll. Yeah.
We have about 4 minutes left, and I would like to totally break script again because I love to be unpredictable. And Dan, I wonder if I could get, yesterday you basically mentioned that your phone a friend lifeline for a technical question is Dan Zimmerly.
True.
And so I think you guys have nurtured a regulatory and academic relationship that I think is just a beautiful model. And so I wanted to ask if each of you could riff for maybe 2 minutes. I'll give you the mic, Dan, on thanks, Dave. What has made that so successful and what makes it so valuable to each of you?
Dan answers me when I send him an email. It doesn't just fall down to the bottom and go disappear into the abyss. I hope I do the same most of the time.
I think it's been interesting trying to figure out what it is that you needed. So we're not the brightest bunch. So it took us a while to kind of figure out what the bridging bit was that needed to be done and sort of where we could kind of fill in. And then I think that the other thing is sometimes we can move faster because we're not quite as constrained. And so we can do things like you'd work, the state of Colorado was working with another university on a drive-around survey. That university wasn't very comfortable or familiar with the oil and gas industry. So when they got detections, they had a hard time getting them to the companies. We, on the other hand, is like, just call them up.
Right.
Okay. And so part of it is sort of like fill in, where we can fill in and where we can have this sort of ongoing educational process, cross-educational process, so we can understand what you need or what the state needs, and then, where our limits are and what we can provide.
Yep.
So we also have no, Steph, you're not going to get that.
Yep. Well, or here's maybe who you should talk to, so that I can go cold call them, or you can introduce me to them, and so that's been a really helpful thing, is making the connections and saying, here's a person to go and talk to, even if it's just brainstorming on, okay, this is the problem that we're running into. What can we know? And what can't we know is really, really useful information, because then we know what we can't know and we can move forward with what we can. And because that is the way of policy, right? We can't always wait for the perfect information. Our academic partners, they sometimes want a little more black and white certainty. And that's when I get to say, it's a really interesting problem that you're dealing with there, uncertainty. I'm not touching it right now. We're going to move forward with this, but please keep working on it, and we'll circle back. So there's some good ways of getting. We want the truth, right? If we can tell each other the truth, and we can just be honest with one another about, yes, you can, no, you can't, then we all can move forward together, and that's been something that I've enjoyed, Dan.
Well, thank you so much. This has been so wonderful, and thank you again for coming, and it's been so wonderful to have you.
Thank
I'll
you.
continue this fangirling a little bit.
Yeah, thank you.